Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business for the King's Justice, attend now, you shall be heard. Long live the King, the Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. Good morning, all.
Good morning. Morning, Your Honor. I've asked the witness just to wait outside down the hall for a moment while we address the issue of the objection from my friend.
Yes.
So I have a proposal on how we can carry out your ruling from yesterday. I've cleared it with my friends. They seem to be in agreement.
Very
The
good.
proposal is that when we have the witness come back in, I will advise him that there was an issue.
Yes.
I will identify the slides and I'll identify the passages that were an issue and that the court has made a ruling that they are unnecessary. And I will not be asking any questions about them.
Okay.
So, and what we've done is Ms. Gaggy stayed up late last night and printed new slide decks with those passages redacted.
Okay.
So I would like,
I annotate as we go along. So I was hoping I could just hand this to you. Did you just take out those pages?
we just put a black box over those sections.
All right, I'm just going to ask you to annotate mine. Or sorry, to redact mine, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course.
Very good.
So I plan to hand those redacted versions up to Mr. Hamill and he can compare them and be satisfied that we didn't make any other changes. And then we'll enter the redacted version as the official exhibit at the end.
As the numbered exhibit.
That's correct. So that's the plan.
Very good.
Thank you.
Good solution. Thank you.
Okay, I think he's done.
It's 40 and 41, is that correct?
That is correct.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Hamill. I hope we didn't keep you waiting too long.
No,
So as you may have guessed, there was an issue yesterday, a procedural technical issue. I was going to explain what happened. So do you have your slide deck in front of you?
I do.
Okay. If you turn to slide 40, that's 40.
I'm there.
So there is a bullet on the bottom half that refers to evidence of Professor Stiglitz on the stand. Do you see that bullet?
I do.
Okay. And on the next slide, slide 41, the bullet at the bottom as well refers to evidence, a testimony of Professors Mintz and O'Riordan.
Yes.
So an issue was raised by my friends in regards to those two passages. The court has considered the issue and has made a decision about them. So what we're going to do is that I'm not going to ask any questions about them, and they have been deemed not necessary for your evidence. So what we have done is that Ms. Gaggy has printed up new versions of your slide deck with those particular bullets redacted. So I'm going to hand this up to you. You can take a look.
Okay. Thank you.
So feel free to compare that to the original slides. Because nothing else has been altered.
Yep.
Satisfied?
That's fine.
Thank you. And then we'll just continue on the rest of your evidence otherwise.
Okay.
So I would like to enter this redacted version of the demonstrative as the numbered exhibit 58. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to start the day by going back to your very last exchange with the court before we ended yesterday, just to clarify something. So we were on slide 33.
Yes,
Okay, and I think you described this as a summary slide for this section. Is that correct?
that's right.
Okay. Yep, there it is. And on the transcript, if you can pull up, is page 156. So I'll just explain to you, Mr. Hamel, at the end of the day, we get what we call a rough transcript. It will be finalized later on. So there may be some discrepancies, but it is a rough transcript of the day. So when I looked at it, if you go back to the previous page, sorry, the court had asked you, and can you tell me what the number is so I can see what you're speaking? And I believe you were on this slide at that time.
Yes,
See that?
I do.
Okay, and I can take you through the whole answer, but the key provision I want to take you to is on the next page. I'll go there first. It's highlighted. And you answered, is it a typo? I know that there are other places where I concluded from the work papers, they must draw conclusions about the demand assumption, etc. And in reply, I was told, quite strong, don't look at the work papers, but to look at the actual written report, that I was wrong to look at the work papers. For example, where it said that this money would be collected because that's how the work papers read. Do you see that?
I do.
So I just want to clarify, when you said you were told not to look at the work papers, who told you that?
That is poor wording on my side. I was not told not to look at work papers. What I was, the reply report to my initial report, well, backing up, I saw a contradiction or a difference between how the report was written and what the work paper said with respect to whether the money was collected. And I centered my first report on the idea and phraseology about as if that money was collected. And I was told via the reply report of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins that no, that's not what we meant. You need to look at the body of the report to determine what we meant, and this is a value that they were doing, whether it was collected or not. And so that based on that, I drew the conclusion that where there is a difference between work papers and the report takes priority. I wasn't told not to look at it. That's poor wording, but the priority should be given to the report itself.
Right, thank you for clearing that up.
So what you're saying is in the reply report, there was a response to your comments, and the response was, in the report, this is set out.
Yes, in essence.
Was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No.
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's move on to slide 34. Now, you said there were 3 sections to your rent analysis, and this appears to be the next section. It's titled 3C, Potential Relevance of Theoretical Uncollected Economic Rents. So, and that section starts at slide 35.
Yes, and I think it's fair to say this is also could be titled Potential Implications of Theoretical Uncollected Rents, reflecting the court's preference to stay away from the word reliance. Relevance.
Okay, so on slide 35, you start this section. Can you tell us what you're addressing here?
In this section, and I have an overview on the next slide where I talk about the applications that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins do. But there's a loose end that I wanted to cover, and this is a good place to do it. This is part of the support that they reference as to why we should be looking at the total economic rents as they determine it. And they have a statement, they discuss how if the Crown, that if we weren't looking at total economic rents, then the Crown could have an incentive to undercollect, an incentive based on trying to avoid obligations under the augmentation clause of the treaty. And that based on that incentive, we'd get it would be, lead to an outcome that was unfair to the plaintiffs. I deal with that issue here, and I noticed that this is, they cite this as a partial justification of the reliance on, on economic rents. And they talk about, and I'm quoting here, protecting against such self-serving behavior would have been in the minds of economically rational parties. And they go on, I won't continue with that. I want to note that, first of all, they don't provide any support for this, that this was actually a consideration at the time. This is their economic rationale for it. And which is what I'm dealing with, is the understanding their position on the basis of economics. But later, they also conclude that this did not occur. They conclude that the economic rent collection decisions were made without regard to the augmentation obligation. So this theoretical.
I'm just going to warn you, when you read anything, it's very natural for most people to speed up. But I'll just tell you to slow down.
Thank you. So let's see. They reached a conclusion, and I reference it here, where they conclude that economic rent collection decisions were made without regard to augmentation obligations. So this is a theoretical issue. It's part of the basis they use for the economic rents, but it's not, there's no evidence of it. They don't reference it, and they actually conclude this did not occur.
So if I can just stop you there, what do you mean by no evidence is referenced?
In their report, either one of them, was there any reference to any evidence? Did they cite any contemporaneous evidence, any documents from the time? I'm not a historian. I did not go back, but in my initial report, I pointed this out, and in their reply and at trial, they didn't find any evidence for under collection of rents.
Thank you.
And I also point out that if this had been a potential, as a theoretical possibility, that does not mean that the proper collection is the full economic rent. I see a disconnect between.
Sorry, when you say if this had been a potential, the under collection?
Right. If the
Okay.
under collection was a potential, I do not see a direct connection to that, to therefore the full collection of all economic rents would be appropriate. If there is under collection, it is that degree of under collection that would be what I would consider pursuing and trying to determine what that amount was.
Okay. And in your last bullet on this page,
Mhm.
you use the phrase correct hyphen collection. Can you explain what that term means to you?
Right. This is, I'm referencing here what would have been the proper amount that the Crown collected of economic rents had they not pursued under collection to avoid obligations under the augmentation clause. So there would exist in this world where they were influenced, a non-influenced amount. So, and there's, at the time, the amount they were collecting was certainly less than full economic rents. There's no history of them ever doing that for this product, or there's, to my knowledge, no evidence of anyone doing that anywhere at that point in time, collecting those full economic rents. And so that degree that they were actually collecting would have been something other than that full amount.
Sorry, could you just explain in detail what you mean by under collecting to avoid payment under the augmentation clause?
This under collection to avoid is a act taken to minimize the collection, to reduce obligations that might exist under the treaty, to have a direct tie between adjusting how much you collect as a result of the treaty obligation. And so if there was such an action, if people took bad behavior to reduce the amount that they were collecting, then there would have been this reduced amount that they actually collected. And you would compare that to what would have been collected had they not had bad actions, bad behavior. And that not bad behavior, that's what I'm calling, normal collection, or what would have been collected absent bad behavior, that number is not full economic rents. It's something different than that.
So let me see if I get the last little bit. One, you say there's no evidence that there was under collection.
Mhm.
And secondly, if there was under collection, not sure if I have this point right, it wasn't done to avoid treaty obligations.
No, what I'm saying,
Okay.
I'm saying, let me try this with numbers. I apologize for my lack of clarity here. Let's assume full economic rents is 10. And as a result of bad behavior, they only collected 2. We have the question of what would they have collected had there not been bad behavior? I think it's entirely possible that there's some influence, bad behavior as a result, but it might have been 3, not 10, not the full economic rents.
And bad behavior is your short form for trying to avoid treaty obligations?
Yes,
So you say, assume the full economic rents are 10, they only collected 2 in an, with the intention of avoiding treaty obligation.
right.
But
So,
had they not had that intention, they still would have only collected 3.
right,
Got it.
right. And the difference between 2 and 3, we don't have evidence of, and Professor Stiglitz, Mr. Hutching conclude that didn't occur. But what's important here is as I read their report, they're using this difference between 2 and 3, which we've just spelled out as that potential, even though it didn't exist, but that potential to justify including 10.
Let me see if I get that as well. You're saying they identify that 10 is the full economic rent.
Right,
They say that one possibility of only collecting 2, a possibility one must consider is that they only collected 2 to avoid a treaty obligation. But that in any event, Stiglitz and Hutchings say they could only have collected 3?
now,
Or you say they could only have collected 3?
sort of neither. I appreciate the chance to get this.
Sorry.
No, I've struggled trying to be effective in this. Professor Stiglitz, Mr. Hutchings think we should use 10 full economic rents. We all heard that plenty of times here. And we know we didn't collect that. So
Right.
there's this number, 2 or 3, this number was actually collected. Their argument is, as I've referenced it here, is we need to consider full economic rents because of this potential that there might have been an incentive to go from 3 to 2. We know they weren't everyone knows they weren't collecting full economic rents at this time. That's clear in the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Hutchings, and it's true throughout this time period. The Crown, everyone knows they don't collect all these economic rents. But what the argument put forth, and I'm referencing on this page, is to support for why we have to look at full economic rents. Is there some potential for some, I'll call it, minor reduction as a result of bad behavior? Now, not necessarily minor, but I'm trying to get that difference between 2 and 3. That's what they're talking about here and saying as a result of that potential, and we know it didn't even exist, we need to look at full economic rents.
So where's the 3 come from? Do you say Stiglitz and Hutchings concede that 3 was the most collectible?
Well, so now we look in the real world. Let's assume in the
Yes.
real world with my numbers, we collected 3.
Right.
And that doesn't have bad behavior. And so in the real world, we have 3, that's the NCRs, Mr. Hutchings calculated. If because there was a potential that those could have been reduced, that's the basis upon which Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings says, nobody would agree to that. We need to look at full economic rents because we can't trust that number 3 is the right number.
So it's not that, you're not saying without that intention, that bad intention, they would only have collected 3. They did only collect 3.
They did only collect 3.
Got it.
There's no admission of, there seems to be unanimity. There was no bad intention in collecting 3. There's statements and further slides I have from Professor Stiglitz that there's no claim of bad behavior at all. But because of this potential, all of a sudden we go from 3 to 10.
Got it. Thank you.
So let's move on to the next slide, slide 36. And you mentioned this is an overview slide. Could you just take us through your overview?
Yes. And I'll get into this in more detail, but they assert the full value of economic rents is the appropriate basis for consideration of the augmentation clause. And they assert these rents should be considered regardless of whether the rents are actually collected. I don't think there's anything new in that statement, but that's the starting point. For quantification standpoint, in my review, I don't see a difference between quantifying the potential rents that could have been charged or just calculating what could have been charged. I know this is, after the difficulty of the last point, this is another nuance, but it came out, and it's actually where we started this morning talking about the difference between what I did in my first report and the second report. They have said, just to refresh on yesterday, economic rents are those which can be collected by the Crown, by water rentals. We went over that yesterday. They did analysis that looked at water rentals and what was collected. That's their basis. But they say that shouldn't have been, they didn't have to impose that, Brendel. And I understand the court was aware of that. That's not new information. From an analytical standpoint, it's the same calculation, whether you insist they should have done it or we just need to have calculated it. It's the same thing. So it's important to me because I phrased it this way, and in my reply report, they attacked it as not being relevant because I assume they collected it. But it's the same calculation either way. And so in my reply report, I took the same arguments that I put in my initial report, where I phrased it as if they collected it. And then the next time I took the same issues and it's as if they theoretically calculated it. I didn't see a different either.
Your difference, if I can just narrow in, your difference of opinion with Stiglitz and Hutchings is not on the value of the economic rents, because I think, if for the most part, I think that, but on whether it was collectible. This point that you're making now.
No, the value is a function of collectability. There is a major difference between them. That is not my position, because there can't be a difference between collectability when you calculate with collectability or not. You can't say, in my mind, one can't say, oh, that's the value, and we're just debating about whether we could collect it or not. That is inconsistent with their theory of economic rents, because their theory of economic rents is that which could be collected.
And this is the point you made yesterday.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it is, I mean, that's how they've defined it. That's how I've worked with it. That's how their analysis works. There are multiple definitions of economic rents. Other people talk about what can and can't be collected. I've tried to go directly to what they did so that we can dig into the details of it. And they've said it has to be, a number that could be collected by the Crown. And that's why I had a slide with multiple quotes of them with that statement. So is that in this section, and I'm down to the third major bullet here, we're really honing in on what I'm calling the uncollected hydroelectric economic rents. I'm going to use that term a lot. Obviously, water rentals were collected and received, and those are the net Crown resource revenues that Mr. Hutchings calculated. Those are economic rents. They're not necessarily all of them, but that's what they are. And so when we apply the economic rent theory, it's only of consequence if it results in a number higher than that value. And for example, in the last 2 decades, they applied the theory, but they didn't raise the numbers so that, we were back to the same net Crown resource revenues for the last 20 years that were actually collected. That was shown in the in the slide 33. Pull that up.
Oh, sure.
The last two numbers here are much smaller than the others because as a result of the issues we talked about yesterday, they just used the Mr. Hutchings calculations of water rentals. So those are rents, but they're not, there are no uncollected rents. So the same numbers that Mr. Hutchings came up with. So now going back to page 36. What I'm focusing on here are the uncollected hydroelectric economic rents. That's what's relevant to this review of this part of the report. I review the basis upon which they claim their economic rents should be considered. I review the Crown's partial receipt of uncollected economic rents through income taxes and their discussion of that and how it's relevant to the hydroelectric sector. And I demonstrate why it's unreasonable to consider uncollected economic rents as Crown revenues or excess profits. That's where I'm headed with this in this section.
Go ahead.
Okay, and so can you take us through your next slide, slide 37?
Sure. This is the foundation slide that I see, at least reflecting what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings based their conclusions on. I cited the treaty at the top and a quote from Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' report. As economists, not lawyers, they talk about the natural use of language and the binding constraint of not providing more to the Anishinaabe is that doing so would entail loss. They go on about the natural readings, the cost of managed land exceeds revenues or that could be raised. And then they close with, without parsing of the form of those revenues between royalties and income taxes. And I'm focusing coming up on that parsing. That is, to me, is relevant. My last bullet here is that is important to my evaluation is where those rents go and how, where do they end up at the Crown as income taxes in particular. The second to last bullet is, again, in reaching this conclusion, they don't look at contemporaneous evidence in their report. They draw this conclusion based on their economic perspective.
Okay, and if we can move on to slide 38.
Okay.
This slide is titled "Uncollected Economic Rents Are Passed On to Consumers." What do you mean by that?
So I'm going to follow through where the economic rents, the so-called, but not so-called, the uncollected economic rents, where do they go? And HEPCO, which has the vast 91% of the hydroelectric generation in Ontario, is a non-for-profit entity. They don't profit from these value of water, but the lower costs do go on to consumers. As we consider this, I think it's useful and helpful to think about Mr. Hutchings' characterization of rent as excess profit. And when we cut the cost to consumers, they get the benefit, but they're not excess profit. This is, I'm perhaps splitting hairs on words, but these economic rents aren't rents anymore. They were potential rents, but they are not profits to customers. And the reason that's relevant is customers don't pay income taxes on the basis of lower cost electricity.
Well, profits don't usually go to customers.
Right. I mean, yeah, profit. I mean, customers don't have profits, right? And if those are residential customers, certainly, but there's a potential for those being businesses as well. And Mr.
Is it
Professor,
possible to use the word savings or
Um,
economic advantages? As I'm trying to understand what you mean by the word profit. Profits don't go to customers. Profits never go to customers.
right, so they're not profits, they're not rents anymore. The label of rents doesn't apply to this money anymore. Now, there's value, the benefit is perhaps the term, does end up going to customers. I'm not denying that. And it was potential rents if it had been collected by the Crown,
Mhm.
but it's not rents anymore because it's not profits to the customers anymore. Customers don't get profits. It's not rents. It could have been rents if it had been collected by the Crown, but it's like it rents on a patent. You can collect those rents while you have the patent,
Mhm.
but once the patent expires, everyone used that, you don't collect the rents, customers benefit, but there aren't rents anymore. There aren't rents from every patent ever invented over time that are floating around to customers. Those are all gone once they are not being collected as excess profits.
Okay.
Professor Stiglitz, in his live testimony, talked specifically about businesses and hydroelectricity and how they could get excess profits by getting lower electricity costs. That's not true. It is true that the benefit could go to businesses. I don't deny that. But businesses can only earn excess profits if they have a cost advantage. This lower cost of hydroelectricity to one business in Ontario is being given to every other business in Ontario. So there's no way for them to charge an extra amount to earn that profit. The competition takes that opportunity away. They get lower cost electricity, but they can't profit from that. They don't get excess profits from that.
I'm just, where I'm stuck is, I'm thinking about as a person who lives in Northern Ontario and has regularly, I'm no student of economics or finance or mining, but I have read in the press about the advantages of low power costs, for instance, to the mining industry. And you say, well, the customer, let's say the customer is the mining company.
Mm-hmm.
You say the customer is not making excess profits because of that.
So
That wouldn't be sort of my understanding of this theme that I have read, that the low cost of energy
Right.
available to mining companies is economically advantageous to them.
and
So what am I not connecting?
I haven't quite got there yet.
Oh,
Okay. I mean, where all this goes is in different places. And we've covered off residential, we've covered off businesses that compete with other businesses in Ontario.
yes.
But mines and mining competes on a national, on a much broader perspective. It competes with product on a world stage, or certainly bigger than Ontario. So the mines in Ontario are not competing with other mines in Ontario. That's true. They're competing with the world price, and your point is valid in that situation. So there's
It's
some.
more my memory than my point.
Well, I agree that it is an advantage for mines who compete in a broader market outside of Ontario. And that's what this last sub-bullet, competitors outside of Ontario have their own subsidized electricity prices. What I'm getting at there is when the mines compete with their products, yes, it's an advantage to Ontario to have lower prices. And they're competing, that helps.
Lower hydro prices.
Lower hydro prices. But it's also relevant that every other mine no one collects full economic rents for hydroelectricity. No one does. And so hydro pays, perhaps in Norway, there's an example of attempts to try to do that. But that's how far away we have to go in recent times And I'm studying here the economic rent theory in Ontario for 100 years. And all these other markets have their own subsidization of their own kind. They don't pay full water rental either anywhere. And there's other kinds of subsidies. We've talked about HEPCO's rate structure in a not-for-profit provincially, provincial entity. As you go around the world in places where other minings are, there isn't a purely competitive price. So there is an advantage, but, and it helps, but it's not necessarily economic rents. It's not excess profits because there's so many other factors to consider. And these other competitors in other places have their own advantages, like low-cost hydro that does not include full collection of economic rents. So there could be some there, and certainly low-cost electricity is an advantage and a help. But the idea that this directly translates into excess profits to the mines, I don't think is valid. And we could also consider, and I'm not an expert on mining at all, the degree to which mines have their own profit structure, and are they in a position, is this excess profit or is this the thing they need to keep in business? And with that, I don't want to go into that. I understand mining is another issue in this case, which is beyond my scope. But all these factors come into play when we try to look at that niche industries which compete on a world scale.
Your bottom line on that is, while there may be an advantage, it does not directly affect profits. It's not translated into excess profits to the mines.
Yeah, it may, yeah. We need to know more about it to figure that out. And we're only talking about that niche of industry that competes on the world market.
Thank you.
Was there anything else you wanted to say about the slide, Mr. Hamel?
Yeah, the last bullet is just reinforcing, and I feel like this is not needed here, but we're talking about excess profits, not the fact that these businesses, such as the mines, certainly have income and pay taxes, but it's the excess profits which we're trying to find as the lower cost hydro costs are passed on to electric consumers.
Thank you.
And so your next slide, slide 39, you
Mhm.
titled it Non-HEPCO Hydroelectric Generators Unlikely to Earn Excess Profits. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. I think the prior slide gave an overview of all the HEPCO resources. And I've mentioned before that there are 9% of the resources, 9% of the hydroelectric resources in Ontario are owned by non-HEPCO, which are for-profit firms.
Mhm.
And to complete the picture of where the economic rents go, we need to consider that 9%. And do they earn excess profits? And I conclude they do not. And the reason is, not because they certainly are for-profit enterprises, or I assume they are, but because they need to sell into an electricity market that's dominated by Ontario Hydro, HEPCO. So while they may have low-cost hydro, they're not selling at a market that allows them to earn excess profits. As a matter of fact, they're selling into a market with an enterprise that has below normal rates of return. HEPCO's a non-for-profit, funded by provincial debt, essentially, enterprise. So it's a very low-cost enterprise. And to capture this, to think about this, we back way up about how rents are calculated. Rents is the profits minus the normal rates of return. And there's been a lot of discussion by others in this case about what constitutes the normal rate of return. Well, prices for electricity are set by an enterprise that has cost of capital far below the normal rate of return. And so these for-profit hydro units are competing with it. They're not earning excess rents. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the hydro units that were originally developed in the early years in Ontario have been transferred to HEPCO or sold to HEPCO. And there's worth having the sites, but this was not a business that was worth keeping operating as an independent entity. And so that's why we see the shift in generation. But anyway, this is just to cover off the 9% of the non-HEPCO resources and why they are, I said unlikely because there could be examples, but the factors of economics drive to the conclusion that they do not earn excess profits. They don't earn rents on this, the fact that the Crown doesn't fully collect economic rents. Or put it another way, the non-HEPCO units don't earn economic rents on the basis of the uncollected economic rents by the Crown.
So if they don't earn excess rents, how does that affect the overall calculation of hydroelectric economic rents for the province?
Well, the economic rents, these theoretical uncollected economic rents pass on to customers and consumers, but they're no longer rents. And its key is no one's paying income tax on this. There was testimony and it's in reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings that gee, the Crown is benefiting from, even if it doesn't collect these rents, it's collecting, it benefits through income taxes. The prior slide where I quoted them, where they talked about not wanting to parse the source of energy let me go back. Without parsing the form of those revenues between royalties and income taxes.
Sorry,
This
you're
is-
referring to slide 37.
Yeah, 37. In the bottom here, their quote, they said, the natural reading of the loss is that the cost of managing the land exceeds the revenue raised or could be raised without parsing the form of those revenues. And they go on at length in their report and in testimony talking about how those revenues could come from royalties, but if they're not from royalties, then they're coming from income taxes. And the last two slides I went over were to show that in hydroelectricity, I see no basis to make that assumption. And the only specific reference that was made by Professor Stiglitz about this had to do with general businesses, where he made this claim that they could just raise their prices, they could capture it through the price of their product. And I've shown how, with the possible exception of things like mining, that's generally not true. And so the idea that all the benefits come through in income taxes, it's just not true.
I don't want to push this too far, but again, I'm relying on my memory. As I recall, there was a big competition between Ontario and Newfoundland for some kind of mining activity. And so it's not just global. Isn't that, couldn't that be the case? I just refer back to your answer that that this advantage to the mining sector is significant only in the global market.
I meant, you should interpret my use of global as to be everything outside of Ontario.
Got it.
That's the interpretation. But your example raises a really interesting question or comment. If the low electricity prices in Ontario allow it to compete with Newfoundland to get a facility built, that's the general gist of what I
Yes.
got out of your. What we're saying is demand is a function of the lower price. The total consumption of hydroelectricity, how much is generated, is a function of the price. If we remember yesterday,
Just like washing machines.
just like washing machine. Yep,
Okay.
and that's they didn't consider that at all. And we have this tension between not wanting to consider it at all over there, and then it becomes relevant here. This is hard to pin down. They keep changing the perspective.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, if we can move on to slide 40. Now, without referring to the specific example you had at the bottom of this page, can you explain what you're saying here on this slide?
Yeah, this is a recap to what we talked about just a moment ago. these theoretical hydroelectric uncollected economic rents are unlikely to be excess profit to any entity. It's unlikely to be rents. They're not rent anymore. You know, I soften the language because there can be exceptions in certain circumstances, and we've talked about that. But in general, you know, retail customers are typically 30% of load. And I'm talking about my background in the industry, not Ontario specific, but in round numbers, 30% or more are residential customers, 30% or more are commercial enterprises. Those tend to compete with other people in the area, so they would fall into those categories of businesses that compete with other Ontario businesses that also have low electricity prices. And it's only in that final 30% where you have manufacturing and industrial firms, and some of those might exist in the mining example we talked about, but some of those are also making local products, manufacturing things for the construction of homes, for example, which is traditionally not shipped far and wide. So there may be some exceptions, but the theoretical uncollected rents are unlikely to be excess profit to any entity. Professor Stiglitz refers to these as rents without explaining how it meets that definition. Now, I will say it is common in the literature when we're talking about whether we want to raise taxes, revenues, water rentals, to talk about as collecting the rents as if they exist. But they're really, as I read that material closely, it is potential rents that could be collected if you invoke those laws, if you invoke higher water rentals or other revenue mechanisms. Until you do that, there's value, but they're not rents anymore because they're not excess profits. And I make this distinction here because this is what this case is all about. This is about the augmentation clause, the treaty, revenues to the Crown, you know, value, whether it's, you know, proper assessment of value. So these distinctions matter. And I think it's not, you know, we need to be clear about where that money goes. And in the hydroelectric sector, it's not rents anymore.
Can you help me with this last point? These distinctions matter. I make this distinction, these distinctions matter. Can you articulate again for me, please, that distinction?
The claim is that these are rents, that we need to we can calculate potential rents. And potential rents is the essence of the analysis that they conducted, Mr. Hutchings conducted. But if you don't collect those, then they dissipate to others and they're not rents anymore. And so I think as we try to consider what the augmentation clause means and what the net Crown resource revenues are and what revenues should be included or potentially included, we should be clear that those values aren't rents, they dissipate. And the next slide talks about it further, but these benefits go on to others, or they effectively disappear in the economy. I mean, the consumers have the benefit, but they're not excess profits to anyone.
They disappear into the economy.
Yeah, not right. They're not excess profits anymore.
So they have a different name. It might not be excess profits, it might not be rents,
Mhm.
but whatever that value is,
Mhm.
when it disappears into the economy,
Mhm.
it's not going into the account from which augmentation can be paid. Like it just sounds like it evaporates because it doesn't fit into one of your defined terms or one of, as you say, one of the terms as defined by Stiglitz and Hutchings.
That's partly true, yes, but it's The I'm drawing a blank. The economic rents were there when we collect them. And if we define it as something that can be collected, fine. But it's not, if we look at that and assume, as Professor Stiglitz said, that, oh, these are crown revenues in other forms. I don't want to parse the form of the revenues. He's implying that this revenue exists somewhere else.
That it is actually a revenue.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that it's actually a revenue. And I'm taking this in two parts. The first part here is where we see the benefits go to people who appreciate the benefits, like consumers, clearly appreciate lower costs. And on the next slide, I'll talk about other places they go.
So, to answer your question, Ron?
I think I perhaps was just having more problems than I should have. This is just essentially a repetition of the main theory that economic rents are not necessarily revenues to the Crown. And there may be many reasons for that.
The theoretical rents are not revenue, not entirely revenues to the Crown, true. And they don't, the people they go to do not earn excess profits. There's no one earning excess profits on these, which was part of what Mr. Stiglitz made a point of, that these are excess profits somewhere. They're rents. They're not rents if they're not excess profits. There's value if they collected it, but they're no longer rents to some entity. Someone's getting excess profits, economic rents, returns greater than a normal return after considering the factors, all the framework that he laid out for that.
But as I understand it, when you finish, they may in fact be savings to, for instance, residential or commercial customer.
It's a lower cost to the customer. Yeah, there's a price difference. You know, it depends where we start from. If we
Okay.
collected rents, it would charge more.
Okay.
I
Thank you.
just want to follow up on the court's question. So if these rents are dissipated, is there always someone to receive it, whatever, a portion of it?
No, I mean, they do dissipate. They dissipate in different ways, and that's what the next slide's about that we have up here now.
Okay.
Okay.
So to slide 41.
So I start here, it's titled Hydroelectric Uncollected Economic Rents are not count revenues and are not excess profits. And we've talked about that. This is the same. Wait. We did that already. I'm sorry. Uncollected hydroelectric economic rents dissipate in other ways. I go back to I start with the definition, the first definition that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings provide is they talk about this rents being the surplus over the cost necessary to exploit that resource. And it treats the cost necessary as a knowable and uniform value. That's what they do. This, and they have slides on this talking about paying capital, paying suppliers, and paying labor. So that's what the surplus is. But this is a theoretical construct. It seems obvious, but we do not have an accounting record of rents. We do not keep track. Firms calculate profits, but they don't calculate rents where you determine what this cost necessary is. They have the real cost, they have profits, but we don't go into this determination of what is the normal, the cost necessary as he defines it. This is just a notional concept. And the fact is every firm has different costs. I mean, that's what competition is. Firms all have resources, all have different skill sets, all have different market strategies, and they have other sources of rents. Rents are common for whether it's patents, innovations, locational differences, all the different things that are in the theory of rents are all part of this. And we don't have a basis to break out, they don't keep track of these economic rents specifically. It's not an accounting record.
So if I can just stop you there, you called it a theoretical construct. Is there a way or a process to, if you wanted to measure those rents, is there a way to do it?
Yeah, there could be. Certainly, we could have a firm come up with a practical way of collecting rents, but we need a lot more determinations than exists.
Sorry, was the question collecting rents or calculating rents?
How would you do it?
How do you
Calculate-
which?
Calculate.
Calculate.
Right, calculate.
So I thought your answer started to be about collecting.
I didn't mean it to be.
Okay,
Firms, if a firm had to calculate its rents, it would need a lot of information about what the costs necessary were and all these other factors. And this is something clearly economists have a role in playing and defining, but it goes way beyond what economics. You'd have to have accountants, you'd have to have determination of these factors. This is not a practical concept that could be readily implemented by a firm in a standard for doing formal recording. There's too many assumptions that you would need for a firm to calculate its rents that are too loosely defined. Just, to pick one possible issue, there's many different ways of considering depreciation. And we don't
we've
have,
heard them all.
I'm aware of that, and I'm not getting into it. But if we think about calculating regular books, the accountants do, there's their book depreciation, there's tax depreciation, there's others. And for someone to come up with a business to adopt a process to come up with rents for that firm, you'd need to nail all these things down. And that's a big step. And I appreciate hearing from the court that you don't need to hear me say that. But these are the kind of uncertainties that need to be pinned down before you could actually calculate this. We are a long way going from a notional concept to something that could be implemented by a firm.
I didn't mean to interrupt you there. So I think
Okay.
you're on this third sub-bullet.
Yeah, and so the third bullet here talks about rents can be lost to poor management or other factors. I quote cite Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, but backing up more broadly, if a firm's got a lot of excess profits, they tend not to have the tightest control on costs because they don't. And so you have excess people around. They're not earning rents. That value is being dissipated through inefficiency. When you have a competitive market, it's not true that everyone has the same costs and same profits and the same margins. That's what competition is, winners and losers. When you give in a competitive environment, the better firm succeeds. But when we give rents to something with economic rents to a particular firm, they don't have to have had the lowest cost operations, the best mechanisms for exploiting that. So there's efficiency losses that could come into play there. So that's one point. I want to sort of pause there. You can lose your efficiency, it could be dissipated other places. And the last bullet here, I find really interesting when I look at Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins' assertion that some rents go to labor, input providers, and capital providers. I mean, they have slides on that, and they talk about that. I know why it goes to capital providers. That's excess profit. It is by definition a capital return. That's what rents are. The only two other costs to a business, as they've structured it, is labor and input providers. Fair enough, I can work with that. Why are they capturing rents? The definition is a firm in a competitive environment wouldn't pay more than necessary. The quote at the top of the page talks about the surplus over the cost necessary, as if that's a fixed known amount. And that's what you would do. And yet, when we actually get in a world where there are rents, they assume that some of the rents go to labor and input providers, which contradicts the idea that there is this fixed amount that no one would pay, and excess profits is excess profits. I mean, the firms with a special attribute to earn extra money is going to pay its employees, and there could be reasons why they want to pay their employees more or pay their suppliers more. I'll get into those.
Can I just ask, sir, your comments now are a general critique of the Stiglitz and Hutchings approach? They're not particular to hydroelectricity, are they?
These are general, that's right. And
Okay.
but it builds on what we build up before of where does it go? It doesn't go to, in the hydro sector, it goes to these other places.
All right.
But that's not the end of the story. It's also these issues like labor and
I'm
cost.
just pointing, Ms. Lewis is up, but just, I'm just pointing to the bottom major bullet on 41. We possibly have had this evidence.
Yeah, I think it'd be
On,
helpful just to limit answers to hydroelectric.
Okay,
Ms.
if that's the
I
case, then
think-
yes, he's not qualified as an expert economist to opine
Yeah.
on anything beyond that.
Yes.
Okay. So to the extent rents under the Stiglitz framework go to people who are paid, who are working at hydroelectric plants. And they're paid more, which is part of their construct of where these rents go. That's not economic rent anymore. And it contradicts, anyway,
Well, I've got your point. Thank you.
yeah.
And I think we're at your last slide, slide 42. And it's titled Actual Water Rental Rates Reflect Balanced Consideration of Economic Rents and Other Factors. Can you explain what you have here?
Sure. I've said multiple times that the water rentals were the collection of economic rents. Not necessarily not the full amount, but they were a collection of economic rents. And I want to highlight the first sub-bullet here, which interesting, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins also look at this. I think we draw different conclusions from it. Ontario's policy has been to fix the annual rental at a moderate sum, and the rental here is water rentals, and thus secure the establishment of new industries rather than obtain the highest possible return which the privilege might be made to yield. And that's from the Commissioner of Crown Lands in 1898. So he doesn't use rent jargon, but if you look at the phrase, rather to obtain the highest possible return, I think that's a pretty good definition of economic rents. And so it's consideration of that concept and a determination for hydro to not fully collect those rents.
That's not a point in dispute.
Yeah, it's not, but it is, yeah. So that has been the policy. These were considered. If I go to 1985, there was a study done, at least 2 explicit studies of economic rents at that time. And there were rate changes that took place that were substantial. You saw that in the charts. Those rate changes did not involve full capture of economic rents. So there was I can't tie those studies to the decision explicitly of what they went for the rates, but I suspect that they were relevant information. It's hard to imagine people changing rates weren't aware of those studies. And so I determined that I conclude it's a deliberate choice to not fully collect economic rents in 1985. 2001 with the Gillen and Wen economic rent analysis. Again, it's contemporaneous with the major restructuring, but not having rates that reflect what was calculated in those studies. And I heard from the court that this is not in dispute. And I'm just pointing out here that with respect to hydroelectricity, there's clear evidence people were aware of this. This was a deliberate choice. And I come next step that Professor Higlitz and Mr. Hutchings don't make any claim that higher water rental rates should be charged. I know that's not new information to the court, but I want to establish that. They don't object to rates and its objectives for social and political objectives that can be a legitimate exercise of Crown's authority. They don't dispute that or assert that it could be done differently. I think Professor Stiglitz would like to see full economic rents as a matter of policy, but that's not expressed as something that should have happened in this case.
Nor do I think it was expressed in the evidence.
Pardon me?
Nor do I think it was expressed in the evidence.
Okay. I could find references if that would be helpful.
Alright.
But
I didn't think that was the main part of the theory. In fact, there was always a distinction whether the Crown should collect or not. It was providing the court with a way of calculating values.
that is the thrust of the testimony. I agree with that. Because I struggled with trying to understand whether because the work papers, as I read them, said that this should have been done, or this was being done. I looked very closely, and I do find where they express a strong interest in preference as a matter of policy for that. I don't believe that's the consequence here.
Right.
And we've covered this earlier today, this last bill, that they do not assert the water rental rates had to be changed out of treaty obligations. Again, the treaty obligations didn't influence the rates that were charged according to them. So my conclusion, and I understand there are multiple issues at play here, but that the concept of economic rents was considered by the Crown, as well as other factors, and that the water rentals that were actually collected reflect the balance of all these issues. And therefore, when we look at Crown resource revenues, what the Crown collected, that reflects all of it, and we fully captured it through the water rentals. There was none lost through income taxes elsewhere, et cetera. Now, I understand, and I hear that the idea of the value should be calculated under this theory as separate. But as I read the clause of the treaty and my interpretation of the rulings in this case, and I'm not here to offer an opinion at all, but I'm just trying to be clear about what I read so that the court can properly weigh it and assess it, that the net Crown resource revenues applicable to the augmentation clause, even after considering economic rents, would still be the NCRRs that were calculated by Mr. Hutchins.
Thank you.
So just want to close off. There were other concepts in the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins. I want to ask you, sir, in your work for this case, do you offer any professional opinion in respect of what interest or bring forward rates should be applied to any amounts that may be found owing?
No,
Do you offer any professional opinion in respect of what's the appropriate sharing model or the sharing of percentage between the Crown and the plaintiffs?
no,
And do you offer any professional opinion in respect of the issue of wealth disparity?
no.
So those are my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamill. Now, the court may have additional questions for you, and then my friends will have some questions.
Thank you. Just let me catch up for one moment,
Of
please.
course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm in the court's hands. I can start right now, or we can take the line.
Your preference if you think.
Could we take a break?
Sure.
We could take a break. I will remind you, although you, I'm sure, have been told, please don't speak to anybody about your evidence during this period. Thank you.
This court will recess for 15 minutes. Oh, now resuming, maybe seated.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. I just had a quick clarification question. You asked us to help you with the redacted slides. Do you want us to hand redact those sections in your version? Is that what you're asking?
That's what I am asking. So when we next break, I'll ask that, and
Of course.
I'll ask you to remind me.
I will. Thank you, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. Hamill.
Good morning.
My name is Caitlin Lewis, and I'm one of the lawyers for the plaintiffs here, the Robinson Superior Treaty Anishinaabe. And I've just handed up to the court registrar a compendium, which is just a collection of excerpts and documents. Tried to keep it organized. We might still have to go to a couple of other documents, your report and your slide deck. But I'd like to start with the compendium, and I'd like to just start at the sort of genesis of your involvement in this case. When was that?
I believe that was the early 2000, first half of 2020. I'm not certain of that, but that's when I believe it was.
Okay, and so if we look at compendium tab 1,
Mhm.
and I suppose before I forget, I would ask that this be marked the next lettered exhibit. Thank you. So you will see at compendium tab 1, we have a copy of your instruction letter, which was appended to your main report. And that's dated June 20th, 2022.
That's right.
So prior to this, did you receive other written instruction letters?
I believe I saw perhaps a draft of this at this time. I don't recall, but that's the only thing like that I might have seen.
Okay, well, on page 2, page number at the top of the page, in the 3rd paragraph from the bottom, says, we understand that you have reviewed the stage 1 reasons for judgment. And then it goes on to say, as well as the partial judgments. So that signals that you had received instructions or direction from somebody to read those. You didn't just do that on your own.
Right.
And do you remember what the form of those instructions were?
My memory is it was verbal.
Okay,
And if I remember correctly, I want to make sure it's clear. I think your earlier question was about written.
yeah, you're correct. Yes, that's fine. So if we can go back to page 1 of this document, which is your instruction letter, in the 2nd paragraph, this is where Ontario sort of sets out a bit of background. So it says stage 3 will address a number of issues. The first issue is with respect to breach. And then on the 3rd line, 3rd word from the end, it starts, if so, what quantum of damages should be awarded referable to net Crown resource-based revenues in the territory from 1850 until 2019.
Sorry, I'm just catching up to where you are.
So
Page 1 of this document.
yes, and I was reading from the 2nd paragraph. I read the
Yes.
first sentence of the first line there,
Yes,
and then I went on to the 3rd line, 3rd word from the end, if so.
thank you.
So you were told as part of your instruction right here to assume that quantification of the past, as Ontario's put it here, damages. You might know plaintiffs call it compensation, but that quantification would be based on net Crown resource revenues.
I mean, I was given this instruction. We're reading it. This is I interpret this as a summary of an issue to be addressed in the court. Yes.
Okay, and so your assumption that NCRRs were the basis to calculate past compensation or damages, that assumption on your part, that NCRRs are what you should use, underpinned your entire analysis.
No, I don't know how you draw that from this statement. This is a background statement. It summarizes issues in stage 3 of the trial. This is in the attorney's words. I was aware of these words.
Okay.
You used it in a way to narrow what I did, and I don't think that's appropriate.
Okay, so what did you take from the words? And I'm reading from the middle of the paragraph, the same paragraph, referable to net Crown resource-based revenues.
Well, this was done on June 20th. I'd been working on this case for 2 years, as we've already established. So I was familiar with stage 3 and these rulings and had done considerable amount of work. I had read the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Hutchings, multiple reports and other materials in this case. And what I took from this paragraph is this was an overview of the background of how we get to court and the issues before the court. Nothing more.
Okay. On the next page, Ontario refers to an excerpt of the Court of Appeal and an expert from the stage 1 judgment, which is in the paragraph second from the bottom on that page. Starts, the Court of Appeal has affirmed.
I see that's paragraph.
Okay. So am I correct in understanding that you were not instructed to look into the value of what the Anishinaabe brought to the table in 1850?
I was instructed to, from the beginning, to look at hydroelectricity as it relates to claims being made in this case on behalf of the plaintiffs. That was the broad understanding and guided my work for years. That was supplemented when I saw the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. And it was my immediate belief and confirmed later that I was to respond to those reports and all they entailed with respect to hydroelectricity. So I understand there are issues that are value there. And that's what I responded to. And that
Could I
is,
just ask you to answer the question that was asked to you, please? And it was, you were not instructed to look into the value of what the Anishinaabe brought to the table in 1850. That was a yes or no.
I looked at all things that related to hydro. That's not the answer to the question. And so I didn't distinguish between what was brought to the table by the plaintiffs in 1850.
So it's
in
fair to say, you
assessing
did,
that.
pardon me, sorry. Finish your answer.
I did not distinguish. You're drawing a line on what I was instructed to do.
Sir,
I don't know what, I don't know if the answer is yes or no.
Okay,
I'd
but
look
you don't
broadly.
tell the lawyer what she's doing.
Okay,
That's
Fair.
all I'm saying.
fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll move on. Your instructions say what they say. The letter then goes on to say, the last paragraph of that page, in addressing the following questions, also consider the opinions expressed in reports by experts retained by the plaintiffs on these issues. Did you look at the expert report of Dr. Paul Driven?
Not in any detail.
How about Dr. Simona Bignami?
I don't think at all. Perhaps I did, certainly not in any detail.
And as you're aware, there were some other plaintiffs involved in this case up until about January. Their experts also prepared some reports. Did you look at those?
I looked at reports that were authored by Professor Beal on their behalf. And there were, I mean, obviously, Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz did work for them directly. I don't remember the distinctions. I looked at all those reports. I am aware there were reports by others, and I did not focus on any reports of others besides those people.
Okay, so it's fair to say your primary focus was on the economic reports or reports of economic experts.
Yes.
Okay, that's fair. So last part of this letter I want to take you to is at page 3, number 2, where Ontario is asking you your opinion of the economic rents theory and analysis presented in the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings as it relates to the augmentation clauses, the NCRRs, and the Court of Appeal decision. Now, what is your understanding of the relationship between NCRRs and economic rents?
NCRs, as with respect to were collected with respect to hydroelectricity through water rentals, and those were a portion of the economic rents.
Okay. So moving on just to the last little bit about the sort of framing of your report and your understanding. If we can go to compendium tab 2. Now, I understand in your main report, you referred to the Ontario Court of Appeal reasons at footnotes 3 and 6. If you'd like to turn them up, you can, but I'm not going to ask you a specific question about that. That's your main report, exhibit 56. But I noticed that you didn't refer to this paragraph. And now I'm reading from compendium tab 2, which is the Ontario Court of Appeal decision in this case. So paragraph 288, the court is discussing that the treaties require the payment of annuities corresponding to a fair share of the value of the resources, including the land and water in the territory. Now, I understand you weren't retained by Ontario to provide any opinions with respect to sharing, correct?
Right.
So we can just leave that aside. So I'd like to go to paragraph 289, where it says, the first form of promise to share in the value of the land is supported on the evidence and was woven through the trial judge's interpretation of the augmentation clause. So it's fair to say that you weren't instructed to take into account that there was a promise to share in the value of the land.
I was instructed to consider the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Hutchins and all they included. I referenced and went specifically to the decision of the appeals court.
Sorry, I'm really not trying to be unfair to you. And I'll much simplify my question. Did this paragraph that I just read to you about sharing in the value of the land have any factor into your analysis of the economic rents theory?
Well, I was aware of it. I was put emphasis in the testimony I gave before the break on the decision of the courts, not the, as I understand, these are the reasons provided by some of the judges at the appeals court level. So I was aware of it. I understand that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins draw a great deal from this. I looked at their report and I focused on the decisions of the appeals court. So I was aware of this, but I did not look at value in this context as it being outside of, as I read it, the rulings of the court. And I base that, I'm not a lawyer, I base that these being reasons of a minority of the justices of the appeal court.
Okay, so just for the record, when you said decisions of the appeal court, you meant the judgment.
Yes,
Okay. And at paragraph 113 of your report, which perhaps warrants turning up, that's exhibit 65. In the middle of paragraph 113, the line starts, the theoretical economic rents. I would like to read the next sentence.
just a second.
Yes.
Oh, the partial sentence. Yes, I'm there.
Yes. So the sentence I want to read starts, the existence of such value is not a source of conservatism because that value is not relevant. In light of having read this paragraph where value,
Can I just get to it, please?
yes,
So we're in the
sorry,
main report.
exhibit 56, page 44,
Thank you.
paragraph 113.
Thank you.
And I just read from 4 lines down. The existence of such value.
Thank you.
So it's safe to say value didn't factor into your consideration of economic rent. You thought it didn't matter.
ultimately, the decision about whether that matters or not, it's a legal determination by the court. And as I spell out here, it is the primary assumption I made in my analysis was that it was not relevant to the net crown resource revenues. But I didn't limit my analysis to that. In essence, I'm not, in an attempt to assist the court, I consider possible interpretations beyond that, which is why I went into the review of the economic rent analysis that they provided, for example.
And we'll get into that in a moment, but today you were testifying with respect to a relationship or a connection between being able to value rents and being able to collect rents. And you'll agree with me that those are two separate concepts. One can value rent and then do a separate analysis about whether it was collected and how much was collected.
If you draw that distinction, you're being inconsistent in your definition of rents from what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings did.
Okay, that actually perfectly segues into a general discussion on economic rents and definitions that I'd like to have with you. So yesterday you gave evidence about your understanding of economic rents and how they're determined in principle. So do you agree that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' economic rent framework is a means to measure net wealth or net value of the resource, in this case, hydroelectricity?
My answer is a bit circular. They have an economic rent framework which establishes value under an economic rent framework. I mean, there's multiple ways to look at rent, to look at value. I mean, there's a wide range of value considerations, including cultural and aesthetic things. Clearly, we're not going in that direction. But economic rents is a notional concept that's used in multiple applications in economics, and you can deploy that to come up with a determination of value consistent with that theory.
Thank you. Okay, so now I just want to ask you a few questions about your testimony yesterday as it relates to definitions of economic rents. So yesterday at page 120, lines 16 to 24 of the draft transcript, you testified, and please correct me if this is not what you recall testifying to. Economic theory tells us that the full economic rent could be captured by increasing the water rental fee. Then you went on to say, that's a very specific definition of economic rents as it applies to hydroelectricity, as it sets up its calculation and its application issues in this matter. So I'm going to suggest to you that that is not a definition of economic rents. Do you agree? I can read it again if you'd like.
I believe I was reading from my demonstratives.
Okay, well, perhaps my friends can direct us to the
No, I can
demonstrative
find
that
it.
says that. Do you want to put the transcript on? Much gratitude to my very helpful friends. They're going to put the transcript up on the screen, so we have something to look at.
You don't have your helper here.
I know, I don't have that extra arm, you know. That's okay. Oh, Mr. Bass, thank you very much. Okay, so page 120, lines 16 to 24.
Right.
So I believe that was, if you could just scroll up, Mr. Bass, I think you are correct. You're referring to a slide now. Like to just find what slide that was.
It's slide 20.
Okay, perfect. So now you've got it in front of me. Do you agree with me that that's not a definition? That's actually a mechanism of collecting rents?
It is not a definition of,
Of economic rents.
but it is.
It's a mechanism of collecting rent.
Right, thank you.
I'm,
Did you want, what line did you want, sir?
That's fine, that's. couldn't see that one.
Okay, thank you.
Would you agree with me?
I interpret this as a definition applied by Professor Stiglitz and Hutchings to economic rents and consistent with their analysis. I mean, I purposely referencing them. They're referencing their theory and what it informs them that the full economic rent could be captured by increasing water rental fee. I interpret that as a definition of the rents as they apply it, and it's certainly consistent with their analysis. I
Okay,
understand there are other definitions. That's why I was clear. I believe there's inconsistency with what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings do on economic rents generally. So it wouldn't surprise me to find other applications that they use. But this is the basis of their calculations and the basis of my review. This and the other quotes that are here.
okay. Well, perhaps that's telling, but we'll move on for now. When engaged in a discussion with the court yesterday, you stated that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings were introducing the idea that we should collect all of the rents, or we should be aware of all of the rents. Do you remember that exchange?
Not exactly, but it
That's all
doesn't
right.
surprise me to say that.
Yeah, perhaps Mr. Bass can bring up transcript from yesterday, page 132. Of lines 17 to 20. All right. So you'll see it right there. I'm going to read, I mean, we can start from line 15 if you'd prefer. It says, right, where I struggle is that, and why I spend so much time talking about it in the prior slide, that their definition is what the Crown could have collected. If we accept that, and it's their definition, then there's a role for practicality. So, sir, I'm going to suggest to you that that is not how economic rents are defined.
If you'd like to introduce another definition, fine.
Could you just focus
I'm-
on that question, please? Agree, disagree, then add to it, but
I'm sorry.
So the definition that the economic rent is what the Crown could have collected, I'm going to suggest to you that's not what it is. And perhaps the best way I can do that is to read to you from Professor Stiglitz slide deck 10. Economic rent of a resource is the value produced minus the cost of the inputs necessary to produce it. Do you agree with that?
That is a broader definition of economic rents. That's on page 41 of my slides. And it's different than what is here. And I understand that is also a definition of economic rents.
So would you agree with me that the definition that economic rents are what the Crown could have collected is Stiglitz and Hutchings' definition? You're testifying that they have multiple definitions for economic rents.
There is inconsistency between these two. There's a degree of what could have been collected. And the broader definition where they talk about a surplus over the cost necessary leads to a broader interpretation of rents. There's other definitions of rents that talk about excess profits to a firm, which leads to a different definition and a different analysis. This is the problem in dealing with a notional concept that isn't enforced by strict rules and definitions. And when you go to try to do a practical calculation and come up with actual numbers, you run into these conflicts. And so I have adopted, because they specified how they wanted to look at it for hydroelectricity, I adopted their definition and their interpretation of this concept for that.
So which definition did you adopt?
I adopted in my review of their analysis the strict definition of what the Crown could have collected, because that's how I did it. And then on page 41 of my slides, I stepped back more broadly and showed inconsistencies between that and the broader definition of the surplus created over the costs necessary to exploit the resource. And there I talked about different costs for different firms, about how rents under the strict definition, under this broader definition, the fact that Professor Stiglitz and Hutchins talking about rents going to other parties, including labor and input providers and capital providers. And we got into an issue that's maybe go beyond just hydroelectricity when I talked about this. But this is the differences between what they calculated and as they move to a broader definition more generally.
Okay, so it's fair to say that your analysis is based on the economic, your understanding of the economic rent analysis that is based on a definition that economic rent is defined as rent that could be collected by the Crown.
That is how I see they did their analysis. It's consistent with that, and I used that definition in my interpretation of their analysis.
So for
Could
you,
you just leave two
Sorry.
breaths between the end of a question?
I suppose I'm in good company with this.
Or bad? Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, I interrupted you right in the middle of your question.
No problem. So let's just assume a hypothetical for right now. That Stiglitz and Hutchings analysis has nothing to do with what the Crown actually collected, and it would not result in higher water rental rates. You would agree with me that your concerns related to their economic rent approach would be quelled.
I'm having a hard time following this example. We're assuming economic rents analysis where water rental rates, where the consumer costs don't change.
Yes,
So the rents are being full. If we assume the the prices for electricity reflect full capture of economic rents by the Crown, that seems to be what you're implying, because that's the price at which you would calculate economic rents.
okay, so your opinion is that you can only calculate economic rents based on what's collected by the
No,
Crown.
no. And there's a lot of moving parts here, so I may be getting tripped up over this. But it's my starting position, which I've tried to make clear, is economic rents are properly calculated with demand that's associated with prices that reflect the collection, that reflect the economic rents. Those prices reflect it. Where that money goes doesn't really matter, but the prices have to reflect the economic rents.
When you say the prices have to reflect the economic rents, what do you mean by that?
Well, one interpretation would be that the Crown collects it. And I understand you want to make the distinction of the Crown not collecting it. So maybe someone else gets it, or maybe it goes into some other place. I don't know. But the prices, economic rents are properly calculated when the prices include the value associated with the economic rents on a per unit basis. You calculate them properly for the province or for the treaty area when the individual prices include the economic rents, and consumer demand is set at that level.
Leaving aside calculating and staying in the world of valuing. So
Okay.
So we're just talking about valuing the resource of hydroelectricity. I haven't asked a question yet.
I'm already confused.
In doing so, you don't need to raise the right to consumers, and demand therefore wouldn't change.
I don't know what value means without calculating. I mean, value to me means coming up with a number.
You don't think you can come up with a number unless you raise water rental rates?
No, I don't think you can value something without doing a calculation. I don't understand the distinction between those two. You've asked me to say value without calculating. I don't know what that means.
Sorry, perhaps that was a confusing question. I was just trying to drill down into valuing without increasing prices or looking at the effect price increases have on demand. But perhaps this is a good time to move on to your specific economic rent criticisms. So yesterday you testified to your three main criticisms of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' economic rent analysis. Now that's on slide 18 of your slide deck. The first, under slide 18B, the first bullet point is inappropriate benchmark for setting rent capturing price. So you testified that Mr. Hutchings fails to consider the lowest cost competitive alternative to the treaty area hydroelectric resources. So, sir, you understand that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' opinion is that you can't use subsidized hydroelectric resource prices to calculate the value of a resource.
No, I don't understand that to be true. I could explain why.
Sure.
They look at Manitoba and Quebec prices. They're subsidized in the extent. Well, first of all, there's a question, what does it mean to be subsidized? And perhaps I should stop there. But in the back of my mind, I suspect that Quebec and Manitoba, which are prices they use, would also fall under any determination of subsidy that you might want to rise.
Sir, are you referring to the grant report when you refer to the Manitoba and Ontario prices, or what are you referring to?
I'm referring to Mr. Hutchings' calculations and his determination of a reference price.
I'm going to suggest to you that Mr. Hutchings' opinion was that those markets were undistorted. They didn't have public policy that offered subsidies, which resulted in low or below full value water rental rates.
I think I need to make sure we're clear what we're talking about as subsidy.
Okay,
I mean,
I'm happy to get there. I'm going to ask you a number of questions about subsidy, but I'd like to just ask you if you agree with me or you recall Mr. Hutchings' testimony that the other Manitoba and Quebec, why don't we put this as hypothetical? If Manitoba and Quebec didn't have subsidized pricing, a public policy to keep water rental rates low, then that is not inconsistent with Mr. Hutchings' approach to take the competitive benchmark.
I found that I'm tripped up by that question, but I would say that Manitoba and Quebec do not fully capture economic rents in their hydroelectric generation, and they are even more heavily concentrated with hydroelectricity than Ontario is.
So you're saying that Mr. Hutchings used too low of competitive benchmark numbers if he looked at Manitoba and Quebec?
I'm saying that there's a lot of moving parts here. He's talked about a competitive price. These aren't competitive. The purely competitive industry doesn't exist in electricity, including in those areas. And he talks about subsidies, which we haven't defined here. So one possible interpretation of a subsidy would also apply there. Does it mean those prices are too low? You know, I don't think they're relevant. I don't have it. I mean, maybe, I don't know the answer to that question. I need to think about that.
I'm just trying to understand your criticism of Mr. Hutchings use of the competitive benchmark. So maybe I can try this a different way. Do you agree that low-cost hydroelectric resources from outside treaty territory, the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, but still in Ontario, are subject to the same distortion or subsidies as water rental rates within the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory?
We start with the presumption there's a subsidy here. And I believe I have an idea what that is, but I don't know for sure. And I don't think I accept that as a subsidy.
Okay, I'm going to rephrase that then. Do you agree that the low-cost hydroelectric resources from outside the Robinson Superior Treaty areas in Ontario are subject to lower than full value or fair market value water rental rates?
I don't know what a market value of a water rental rate is. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to try and take you through a hypothetical to maybe get us both on the same page. So suppose you and I won free hockey tickets to Winnipeg Jets versus Washington Capitals hockey game. You would not determine the value of your hockey ticket with reference to the price that I paid for my ticket, right?
In this assumption, we both won tickets.
Yes, they're both
Right.
free, $0.
The value of the ticket would not necessarily would not be tied to your winnings. It would be tied to whether what other tickets were available. We would look at where we would get other tickets.
Exactly. You would look at the price at the box office or the market value for the ticket.
We would look at where you could get other tickets for other people, and to draw the parallel, we'd look for other tickets.
Okay,
But Mr. Hutchings made that analogy and applied it here, and it doesn't apply because here there were more tickets available. That's the issue. There were more. I know that in this hypothetical, it sounds irrational that there would be free tickets to others, but that's the problem with the hypothetical. In this instance, there are the price you paid for your ticket. There are other tickets available to other people that are not being used. There's empty seats in the stadium and they're being given away.
okay, then I'd like to take this one step further. Let's say what if we compared the price of our tickets, which were free, to this stadium that's got so many tickets, to a Las Vegas Golden Knights versus LA Kings game in Vegas? What do you think? The price would surely be more in that area, right?
Well, it would fail. I'm willing to accept as a hypothetical, the prices are higher in this option that is not competitive with what we're looking for here. Yes, it's a
But that is
different product.
that is a competitive benchmark to compare it to another jurisdiction or another area.
We may have overtalked. We might have talked over each other, but I was saying that is not a competitive benchmark. It's, first of all, it's not the same product. And we, in this instance, have more of the same product available in Ontario.
So when you have a lot of a product, it loses its value.
Markets work. You set the price.
Just on
Yeah.
that.
Doesn't lose its value. That's a value judgment. Prices are set by supply and demand. An increase in supply generally reduces the price. An increase in supply, I'm not sure I said that right. Increase in supply reduces the price.
Okay, so moving on, you were just talking about increasing the price, and you testified yesterday to your second criticism, which is incorrect consumer demand assumption. So you would agree with me that your criticism of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' approach, that they use an incorrect consumer demand assumption, is based on increased water rental rates to consumers, which you say would have an effect on demand.
My criticism starts with the basics, the methodology. You measure rents with demand set at the price that equals the collection of those rents. And that's higher than exists in Ontario. That's the crux of this case. And therefore, if you measure demand at a lower price where demand will be higher, you've introduced an error.
Sir, you appreciate that Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz are not talking about raising the price to consumers.
Right.
Thank you. So on slide 30 of your Exhibit S, also Exhibit 58. In the third bullet point,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you repeat it?
yeah, not a problem at all. So I just want to take you to a slide in your slide deck, which is Exhibit 58. Slide 30.
I'm there.
Thank you. You say at the third bullet point, or it starts third, you say they provide extensive discussion of how electricity prices could be kept low through subsidies to consumers or prices. Do you agree that historically water rental rates have been kept low in Ontario?
The low is such a relative term. They are what they are. They did not fully capture all economic rents. I don't know what we're I don't know what, I feel uneasy about it being a relative term, but they could have been higher.
Sir, I'm not trying to trick you. At paragraph 122 of your report, page 46, you don't have to turn it up if you don't want to. It says turning specifically to hydroelectricity and water rental rate, the rates were purposely set low.
Okay.
I just put to you something that was in your report. I wasn't trying to be sneaky.
Okay.
So you agree with that?
Yes,
Okay. In setting the hydroelectricity rates low, you would agree with me that the Crown has made a policy decision not to charge the full value of the water rental rates for hydroelectricity.
there's a leap in saying the full value of the water rental rates. I don't accept that terminology. There is the potential that greater economic rents could have been collected with a higher rate. That's true.
Well, you said they were purposely set low, so that must mean that you think they could have been set higher.
They could have been set higher, yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you agree that the Ontario government distributed some of the hydroelectricity rents directly to customers in the form of implicit subsidies?
I don't consider those implicit subsidies. I know Professor Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings use that terminology. I don't consider it subsidies because it's not a value that it's not a fund. It doesn't show up anywhere. I also will draw a distinction of whether those are actual rents when they get delivered to customers, as we talked about earlier this morning. But the
Okay.
benefits of not having higher water rentals convey to consumers, as I have slides that detail.
Didn't ask you about that, but if we can go to your compendium that I created for you, tab 4.
Okay.
Now, this is an article titled, "How Well is the Equalization System Reducing Fiscal Disparities?" And you see the author here is Robin Bodway. Do you know him?
He's a witness in this case. I don't know. I've talked with him.
You have talked with him?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to take you to a few passages in this article, if you don't mind. So the first one, the page numbers are on the bottom. And it's page 5. So tab 4, page 5.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the second paragraph from the bottom, 4 lines up, the partial sentence says revenues from that source. Do you see it there?
I see that.
Okay, so I'm going to read from the sentence after that citation. As well, a long-standing concern with public utilities, especially hydro, is that part of their profits are dissipated in reduced prices to consumers, thereby causing fiscal capacity to be understated. Your Honor, I'm in my
I'm in the
compendium.
wrong.
Yeah, it was just marked. It has the colorful tabs on the side.
Thanks.
Yes, I just read from page 5 of tab 4.
Got it.
Sir, so today do you need another second to read that?
I've never seen this article before. I take more than a second to read the article, but I've seen the sentence.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm putting to you this statement that as well, a longstanding concern with public utilities, especially hydro, is that part of their profits are dissipated in reduced prices to consumers. Sir, earlier today, you testified that customers don't get profits or that profits don't go to customers. Do you disagree with Robin Bodway?
Taking this out of context here, and especially since it doesn't appear to apply to Ontario, and I say that because it talks about part of their profits and Pepco has no profits. And you know, the profits being dissipated in reduced prices, I don't understand the mechanism behind that. What's associated with that?
Okay, well,
And do I
to be-
disagree with, I am not going to opine on it. I am reluctant to disagree with him. He's a smart guy, but I don't have the full context of this.
So it's fair to say that because you're not an economist, perhaps the interworkings and the mechanics of subsidies and the like, or profits being dissipated in reduced prices to customers is sort of outside of your scope.
I don't accept that.
Okay, well, could you tell me what this means then?
I'd like to read the paper.
You'd like to read
Along,
the,
I would, I would, I mean, I've got a 35-page paper here. I'd like to take time
Okay.
to read it.
well, if you look at the index, it just says new. It's a new document. Yeah.
Can you tell me where you were, please, on page 5?
Yes, I read from the second paragraph from the bottom,
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4 lines up where it starts revenues from that source. I read right after the citation,
Thank you.
as well as a longstanding concern.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, well,
So
perhaps.
I just want to say, ask this. You're saying, sir, you can't take that sentence and understand what it means?
No, I'm reluctant to comment on this and to say whether I agree or disagree with this, with the specific language with here. I'm concerned about what implications that has in the broad context of this paper, which I've never seen. It starts, a sentence that starts with "as well" is an indication that it can't be interpreted on its own basis. I mean, we start with an obvious English reason why reading and interpreting that sentence on a standalone basis is problematic. There's also a reference to part of their profits are dissipated. I don't know what he's talking about as part of profits dissipated.
Sir, I'm going to suggest to you that that is a commonly known economic principle of economic rents held by economists like Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings.
So you're asking me to interpret the sentence. So it's because the sentence doesn't say any rents don't exist in that sentence. This is the context that I was asking why I would want to look at this paper further. But profits are dissipated as a standalone, profits are dissipated through inefficiencies was one of my comments I made earlier today. I don't believe that's related to this, but it's consistent with the phrase profits are dissipated. Is this a rent? Are you asking me to assume that this is rents that we're talking about here?
No, sir, the relevance of this is in calculating, perhaps we can go to the next excerpt that I have that should be a little more illuminating. Page 13 of the same document. Again, the second paragraph from the bottom. It starts another resource related. Now I'll read this out to you. Another resource related argument applies particularly to provincially run hydroelectricity corporations. A longstanding argument has been that unlike with other resources, their rents do not show up as provincial revenues, but are partly passed on to resident firms and households in lower electricity prices. Calculations done in the 1970s indicated that their order of magnitude was comparable to oil and gas revenues at the time. From an equalization perspective, it is as if the rents were collected and then passed on to users of electricity as subsidies. An argument can be made that since these go unequalized, equalization entitlements are overestimated for hydro-intensive prices. Now, the last little bit about equalization, I don't think is germane to what we're talking about right now. Do you agree with this passage with Mr. Bodway or Professor Bodway?
Mr. Hong's on speak.
I have to raise, he's already expressed, he hasn't had an opportunity to read the document, which no one has seen.
But not with respect to this paragraph. We'll hear the answer, and you needn't suggest to him that he.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to comment on this paragraph in absolute terms without having read the context of the full paper and given an opportunity to consider it. There are points in here that I've talked about and could respond to, but as a whole, I'm reluctant. I'm not in a position to agree or disagree with something I haven't had a chance to study.
Okay, well, if we took a break right now and gave you an opportunity to read it, would that be satisfactory to you?
Possibly.
Like,
I
I'll
don't
just
know.
telegraph to you why this is important to me. So
Mhm.
multiple times today, you said profits don't get passed on to consumers and consumers don't get profits. Now, I've taken you to article that perhaps says some things contrary to what you said. And I just wanted to know if whether you agreed with this or disagreed with it or hadn't considered a way of looking at subsidies and hydroelectricity in this way.
That's a very broad and seems to me almost a multi-part question. There's a lot to this paragraph. There's issues that could be raised as a specific question drawing from this that I could respond to if it was isolated as a specific question.
Well, the original question was, do you agree?
Right, and the do I agree with the paragraph is the same answer. It's a broad, I haven't had a chance to read this whole paper, et cetera.
Okay, so I think we have two options. I can go by it line by line and read each sentence to you and ask you if you agree with it or disagree with it. Or I can give you an opportunity to read the document. And if it would satisfy you to take the lunch break now. Or the third option, I suppose, is you just say you can't offer an opinion on what Mr. Bodway is saying here.
Yeah, reading it sentence by sentence, I mean, I think there's another option. But of the three you gave me, I would need to read I'm not going to be able to answer on a sentence by sentence basis and avoid the same problem of not having read the context of the full paper.
And the third option, or your,
Willing to say I can't? No, I understand this.
Pardon, you
The
understand?
third option, I believe, was, is my answer that I can't understand this or unwilling to offer an opinion about this. I don't agree with that. I'm able to read this. I can understand this document.
sorry, I meant you said you were about to offer another option,
Right.
which is,
Which if we take the elements here and put it in the form of a question, is there just a standalone isolated question, I'm here, ready. But and it seems to me that's a pretty easy thing to do. He talks about subsidies. You could ask me about subsidies. You could talk about,
Sir,
So I thought the option offered to you was, could each of those sentences be put to you and asked if you agreed? Is that,
but the agree is to buy into the whole paper.
no,
no,
no. No, I think it's exactly what you're proposing. Take each of those assertions and ask the question.
okay, then I will do so. A longstanding
Just
argument,
Just wait.
sorry,
Is that your preference? Or that you suggest that that is a
Right.
reasonable way to work through this?
The problem with asking each one of those is a standalone sentence, is they aren't standalone. They're in a context of this overall paper.
So you're not proposing that?
Right,
I'm okay, I'm okay.
I'm not proposing that, because I'm breaking the link between the question and the paper.
Okay, there's another option.
Yeah, that was what I was suggesting.
okay, well, I think I have your evidence on that paper and I can move on. Perhaps we'll revisit it at a later time. So at paragraph 127 of your exhibit 56 report, page 47,
My report, page 47.
yes,
The initial or the,
yes, exhibit
you.
56, the first
it.
report.
Starts with paragraph 125.
127.
Okay.
So after footnote 30, which is in about the middle of the paragraph, you'll see there's a sentence that starts while one could.
Mm-hmm.
While one could debate whether the actual price was artificially low or not, or whether it is fair to consider this a subsidy, the key admission being made in the paper that it is that it is advocating for a new and unprecedented approach. Okay, so it's not abundantly clear to me here. You say whether it is fair to consider this a subsidy. So do you agree that Robinson Superior Treaty Territory water rental rates were low because the Crown gave an implicit subsidy?
I don't use that term. Other people might. It's also relevant to the paper we were looking at. I don't think it's fair to think of it as a subsidy. I understand other people might want to use that word and language, and we can work with that under that assumption, but it's not how I would characterize a subsidy. And I could
Okay.
explain why.
Okay. So perhaps we can turn up your compendium, tab 5.
the slide deck?
Yeah, the compendium that I just handed out
Oh.
with the multicolored tabs.
Thank you.
So here I have created a little example that I hope will be able to shed some light and perhaps we can reach some agreement on. So this is a hypothetical. So the Crown receives $1 from hydro. You see that's this little orange slice on the pie chart.
I see that. Could you be more specific about what hydro means? Is that hydroelectric rents or hydro HEPCO?
Water rental rate.
Water rentals, okay.
Crown receives $99 from other revenue sources. So not hydroelectric rent, or pardon me, not water rental rates. So the
Mhm.
Crown nets $100. The Crown is obligated to share $1, the amount they receive from hydro, of the $100 the Crown received with the Anishinaabe.
Mhm.
Assume a sharing formula between the Crown and the Anishinaabe of 84-16, where 84% of the share goes to the Anishinaabe. In this hypothetical, the Anishinaabe get 84% of $1, which is 84 cents, and the Crown gets $99.16. So if we go to the next slide, suppose the Crown realizes that the Anishinaabe have a right to share in the real value of the hydro or the water rental revenues or, pardon me, the real hydro revenues or the real value of the hydro revenues. And that would be wrong to charge $1 for water when the Crown has done a study that shows that the value of the water is $10. So the Crown was charging $1. They know that the value is $10. So in the next bullet point, a hydro expert exclaims, stop. If you start charging $10 for hydro, the demand is going to change and there will be less revenues and less benefits to the Crown if you raise the rates. Next point. A politician agrees and says,
Can I interrupt?
yeah, of course.
I don't. It seems implied here that the hydro expert here is considering the implications to the Crown to raising the water rental from $1 to $10.
Well, I'm getting there.
Well, and I haven't seen this before. I don't understand how this, it's not obvious to me how this results in less revenues.
Okay, let's go through the whole hypothetical and then
Okay.
wait for the question.
So if we look down at the last bullet point, so the second bullet point, the hydro expert says, if you charge $10, demand is going to go down, which is one of the opinions that you offer in your report, right? Raise rates, demand goes down.
That's right.
Okay, so that's what I tried to capture in the second bullet was your point. In the third bullet, a politician agrees and says, if you charge the full value for the water or the hydro, there could be less activity in the territory, which would result in, or could result in, businesses closing, people being laid off, the Crown collecting less corporate taxes, the Crown collecting less income taxes. So still in our Crown revenues hypothetical, the Crown decides that for policy reasons, it wants to continue to subsidize water rental rates so that the price to consumers stays exactly the same. The result is the price increase to consumers, or no price increase to consumers. They still pay a $1 amount. And the result is also that the true value of the water is shared with the Robinson Superior Treaty Anishinaabe instead of only a share of the revenues that is 1/10 of the value. We go to the last slide. I've again done up a nice pie chart. So in this new scenario, still within the hypothetical, the Crown receives $10 from hydro. Then the Crown receives $99 from other revenues, the blue slice. So the Crown collects a total of $109. The Crown makes a policy decision to give a $9 subsidy to the hydro consumer, so the cost to consumer remains the same, the $1. The net amount by the Crown is still $100. And in this scenario, the Crown recognizes it has $10, not $1 from hydro to share with the Anishinaabe. Assume the same sharing formula of 84/16. In this example, the Anishinaabe get $8.40 and the Crown gets $91.60. So, sir, would you agree with me that the $9 subsidy in this hypothetical is not a Crown expense, it's a foregone revenue?
It's interesting. We're taking and offsetting a subsidy with a foregone revenue.
I'm
seems
just
a little
asking you if you
strange.
agree or disagree with me.
I need to work through this example in this study. In verbally,
Sure,
I tried to say, I don't understand on the second bullet,
okay,
when the hydro expert says, stop, if you start charging $10 for hydro, demand is going to change and there will be less revenues. If revenues go from $1 to $10, which is 10 times the potential revenues if the demand doesn't change, then the only way to get less revenues is if the demand goes from 100% to less than 10%. I think that exceeds any reasonable measure of demand elasticity in this industry.
Okay, so sorry, I don't know where that fits into this hypothetical.
Well, you've given me a hypothetical, and I don't understand, there will be less revenues. and
Okay.
less-
This is a comment by, it's not asserted as a fact, it's a comment by a critic or something, isn't it?
Yes, a hydro expert exclaims. It's a hypothetical. So it's a I've set up an example. And I just wanted to walk through it with you.
Can we call this second bullet? It's a fear expressed. That be right?
Yes. And the fear is that if you raise rates, demand will go down.
Can you read it as that, sir?
I can read it that way. I think it's nonsensical in the context of any reasonable assumption of elasticity in this industry, but I can adopt that.
Okay, yeah, it's a hypothetical. So
I also,
I actually thought it was consistent with your evidence and an answer
no,
to me.
it goes
That
down,
if rates go up, demand goes down.
demand goes down, but to get less revenue, it has to go down by enough to totally offset the increase in rate.
Okay, why don't we just go with the first part? The theory you told me
Yeah,
was if rates go up, demand goes down.
Right.
That was an axiom.
right. And that is true. This doesn't say that. I agree with that.
Okay. And when I read this, I thought that's what this hypothetical person was expressing.
It's,
If rates go up, demand goes down. I didn't think that this hypothetical would be an argument about that. I thought that was, you were telling me that was a truism.
it goes down, it's so often the problem in this discussion is where our starting point is. And I can move past this. I agree with you. There is a reduction in demand.
Okay.
But for there to be less revenue overall, this has to be enough reduction to offset.
okay, in this hypothetical, we're not talking about how much the hydro expert says the revenue will go down, or we're not talking about that. We're just talking about the principle that you have testified to, that rates go up, demand goes down. In this hypothetical. Okay. So yesterday, when you were testifying, you concluded that a subsidy is either nonsensically irrelevant or impossibly hard.
Right.
Do you remember that?
I do.
And you said that when you charge a water rental rate to capture rents at the exact same time that you give a subsidy that exactly offsets for the money going back, you conclude that that is economically irrelevant.
Right. Then that's right.
So, sir, you would agree with me in this hypothetical, an explicit subsidy is economically relevant to the Anishinaabe, the Robinson Superior Treaty Anishinaabe.
What we have here is an example or a scenario where we increase the water rental from $1 to $10. And then to make sure that demand is not affected, as a policy of the Crown, we spend money. The Crown spends money to maintain that demand. And that's what you have been labeling a subsidy. And that's how this is constructed. And if you adopt that philosophy, then it seems to me that subsidy is an expense that's relevant to these revenues. So in the net Crown resource revenues, you need to, because that is essential to the calculation and getting the demand which is being used, that needs to be deducted. And it's also true that this is no longer, it's still not the economic rents. It has a consequence as you do the mathematics, but it's not economic rents because we're not measuring it from the right place.
Sir, that was not my question. My question was recording a subsidy in this way, like in this hypothetical, where it's an explicit subsidy, is economically relevant to the Anishinaabe.
Not if we take that subsidy, which we need, The proper calculation of economic rents is at a different level.
Sir,
we-
I'm
if
sorry,
we-
that wasn't my question.
Okay,
I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's a yes or a no question.
no, it's not relevant.
Okay.
I'm concerned that I've gotten tripped up with the yes and no's. Could you ask that question again?
Yeah, of course. I was just trying to get you to agree that in the hypothetical where it's the $9, if you will, is recorded as an explicit subsidy, it's relevant to the Robinson Superior Treaty Anishinaabe in my example.
This example has the Anishinaabe getting $8.70, $8.40 in one scenario, and a different amount, I can't find it here,
84
80.
84 cents in another scenario. It
Okay,
is
so,
relevant, it is of import to the Anishinaabe, and it matters if they get 84 cents or $8.40.
okay, thank you. All right. So now the next section of your criticisms, I believe the next one was practical considerations. And I believe at your slide deck. Page 31, slide 31, exhibit 58. You go on to say that economic rents are those that can be collected, not merely theoretical concepts of value.
Mhm.
I'm going to suggest to you that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings calculated the value of the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. Do you agree with that?
No, there's all kinds of flaws in that analysis
Okay,
with respect to hydroelectricity.
yeah, that's fine. So now we can go to your report at paragraph 127, and which is on page 47. And here you say, under the Gillen and Wentz paradigm, the rents associated with hydroelectricity exist whether they are taken by the government or not.
Mhm.
So you say that there's a value to the hydroelectricity resource above net crown resource revenues.
I'm saying under the Gillen and Wem paradigm.
Okay.
As I've mentioned, there are multiple ways of looking at this, and
Yeah,
everyone
yeah.
seems to have their own.
Do you agree with that?
I agree that that's their paradigm. I'm not offering an opinion about the exact way to do economic rents on my own. I'm not introducing another definition.
So it's safe to say you don't agree or disagree with the Gillen and Wentz paradigm that rents exist, whether they are taken by the government or not.
For the purpose of reviewing their paper, I can accept that their definition and work with that to look at what they concluded and do the kinds of things I did in this paragraph.
Okay. We go to paragraph 129, just over the page. Now, at the very beginning of that paragraph, you say, the Stiglitz and Hutchings RST report makes no provision for the practical challenges in setting water rental rates to reflect changing circumstance. So, and this is again in the context of your analysis of the Gillen and Wen approach, right?
This is a reference to the Stiglitz and Hutchings report. I don't know. No.
Yeah, and it's about, is this reference not with respect to Stiglitz and Hutchings use or adoption of the Gillen and Wen framework?
Yes, there was a they adopted the Gillen and Wen framework. The sentence, as I heard your sentence, you read, you tied the sentence, which seems clearly related to the Stiglitz and Hutchings report, but you tied it to the Gillen and Wen report. That's what I heard.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be unclear. I'll maybe deal with it like this. So now we're under the Gillen and Wen section of your report. And yesterday you testified that despite relying on the Gillen and Wen article, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings in their analysis ignore price effects. And you found a flaw with that.
Right.
Do you agree with me that Hutchings and Stiglitz used actual consumption when doing their economic rent calculation?
Yes.
Do you agree with me that Gillen and Wen use actual consumption when doing their calculation?
They did it as a starting point, and then they spent half of their paper looking at the price effects and consequences of that. So they included the price effect in their ultimate conclusions.
So did it change their conclusion that the aggregate hydroelectric rent in Ontario, or pardon me, did it change their conclusion that the hydropower generated in the province was 1.3 billion in 1995?
I don't know. I mean, I can't, we look at the paper, I don't have that number doesn't mean anything to me.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to understand. You criticize Hutchings and Stiglitz for ignoring the price effect. I'm suggesting to you that Gillen and Wen also ignored the price effect, if you will, in their calculations. And so Hutchings performed a calculation using actual consumption, and Gillen and Wen's final calculation also used actual consumption.
No, the Gillen and Wen paper looked at the price effects quite clearly. I've got a supply and demand curve and tables showing the analysis.
That wasn't my question.
Okay.
In the ultimate calculation that Gillen and Wen did, they used actual consumption in the number that they came to, the 1.3 billion and 1.4 billion.
I need to look at those numbers in that report.
Okay, so you just don't know.
I don't memorize those numbers to know. I know what they did in the report. I've said that multiple times. You're asserting that there are numbers that I don't know from memory, and you're putting characteristics on it that run counter to what I believe that, what I know that paper does. And so the context between that number and that paper, I can't get into the details of agree or disagreeing because I need to look at where it's said.
Sir, at page 40 of the Gillen and Wen article, they say the aggregate hydroelectric rent in Ontario is given by the rent per kWh. No problem. That's fine. Could you put it on the screen? Well, I have one copy, so you can. I thought he was familiar with the paper, and I could ask him a question as it relates to the methodology in the paper. If he's criticizing, sorry, I shouldn't.
Okay, but we don't talk to them.
Yeah, that was my fault. I apologize. I suppose, can you? So for those tuning in, it's trial exhibit 14110.
So you're directing the witness to the passage you were reading, which starts with,
The aggregate hydroelectric rent in Ontario
see if you, let us know when you found it, sir.
I see that.
Okay,
is given by the rent per kWh multiplied by the total kilowattage of hydropower generated in the province.
Yes.
Okay, so you'll agree with me that the total kilowattage of hydropower generated in the province is the actual consumption in the province of Ontario.
You've taken this out of context. Can we pull this up somehow on the screen?
Sure. perhaps I can ask you this. Does what? Okay. I was reading from page 40, but perhaps Mr. Hamel wants to direct us to another page.
So I see on my screen on the right-hand side of page 40, the first paragraph that starts in that column, the aggregate hydroelectric. And those numbers do exist. This is page 40 of the document, and it's true. Those numbers are calculated on this basis. But this is page 40. If we turn to the next page, 41, we see a heading, the impact of a water charge on prices.
Okay.
So it starts with a calculation. The paper's not done. It goes on for page 40, 41. If I go to page 42, actually, what I want to go to is page 44. These are the 25 sectors that the Gillen and One paper looked at for price effects before it determined the consequence of the increased price on demand. And it looked at the consequences for these individual sectors. And there's also a supply and demand curve earlier in this page that lays out the details of how this price shift and demand shift is associated. So this paper, the reason I reference this paper with respect to the question we're talking about is this paper does consider the demand charge, the effect of demand on prices in proper calculation of economic rents. It is true that the figure you pulled from the middle of it is a calculation done on existing demand. That's true. That's halfway through the paper.
So at the end of the paper, do they factor in demand in their calculation?
They have a discussion of the effect. They find it's quite modest. We are dealing with 2001 at this point, but they do factor it in, yes.
So how do they factor it in? I'm going to suggest to you that it doesn't change their ultimate conclusions.
Well, their ultimate conclusion is not a calculation of economic rents. The purpose of this paper, as I read it, is to make a recommendation about what water rental rates might be determined. And so what they do is they have a methodology that has been adopted by Mr. Hutchins and his calculations that looks at the increase. They calculate a number that we've referenced, which gives a total economic rents for the province without price effects. In my reading of this paper, that's not the purpose of the paper. The purpose of the paper is to consider this as a matter of public policy. And so as a matter of public policy, they look at the effects on individual sectors of the economy because they recognize that that will affect consumption. And so that they don't go back, they may not, I suspect you're right, that they don't go back and recalculate economic rents from the preliminary number that they received. But I believe the proper interpretation of this paper is to realize that that was just an intermediate step and not the ultimate purpose. The ultimate purpose of this paper was focusing on what water rental rates could have been charged.
But as you've testified to, even in their calculations or their, not calculations, pardon me, even in Gillen and Wen's analysis, the demand price, the price effect, pardon me, was modest. That's what you just testified to.
It was modest. We were in 2001. In my discussion, I emphasized how this was a much bigger factor in the early years up to the 70s and 80s. We are now in 2001 where the electricity market is dramatically different than the earlier years for lots of reasons.
Okay. So yesterday, the court asked you if Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz said that Gillen and Wen's calculations and assessment was too high or too low. I believe your response was they didn't say, but perhaps you recollect that discussion yesterday?
I remember the discussion.
Okay, well, maybe I can just ground my last few questions before the lunch break. In slide 6 of the compendium that I've done up, which is sorry, I'll wait till you get there.
Slide 6,
tab 6
tab 6,
of the
yours,
Mr. Hamel compendium.
cross-examination.
Okay. So here, sir, you can see that the Gillen and Wen estimate for 1995 is 1.3 billion. And the Hutchings and Stiglitz estimate for 1995 is 0.69 billion. So you'll agree with me that the Professor Stiglitz and David Hutchings calculations were conservative.
Oh, I don't accept that they were conservative. They certainly provide lower numbers than shown here. I don't doubt the representation of those two numbers. And I believe the conversation yesterday was about the Gillen and Well numbers with respect to the 2001 and beyond timeframe. I could be wrong, but that's what I recall. And because it was at that point where Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings used the net Crown resource revenues themselves without any uncollected rents. And I believe the question was, could it be higher, which it could be, and they testified that they thought it would be higher. And then it's in that context, I thought I was asked, what did they say about their expectation of rents compared to what Gillen and Wen did in that time period? And I don't recall them addressing that.
Which time period are you referring to?
2001 to 2019.
Okay, well, perhaps we can just talk about one time period issue that I'd like to clear up for the record. Yesterday at slide 32 and 33 of your slide deck, you were testifying to practical challenges to the economic rents approach.
Mhm.
And if we go to slide 33, the last bullet point on the page says, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings assert that reliable benchmarks do not exist for the 1990s. Do you remember testifying to that yesterday?
I remember testifying that that was what the report said, and that they clearly did analysis that assumed benchmarks and for this time period, which is how we get a higher number. But I don't recall a specific change to the statement in their report about it being an unreliable benchmark. It seems, I recognize that it seems it'd be surprising that someone would present analysis that they themselves would say is unreliable. But I was just referencing the fact that this is a statement in the report and it is contrast to the analysis that was done.
Yeah, thank you for that. But I was actually going to ask you a question about what you meant by the 1990s.
1992 to 2000.
Okay. Sir, perhaps we can, maybe we can just deal with it this way. Sir, I'm going to suggest to you that the paragraph you cited to at that footnote, paragraph 137, was a typo. The period is not 1992 onwards. Do you agree with that?
I will accept your representation. I found I can't recall any, but I thought there might have been other typos in here, and I made reference to them in footnotes, and I don't want to interpret their work for them. I realized that in my own footnote in my report, I said that could have been a typo, but it
Okay.
stands uncorrected as far as formally changing that, including when they revised their report.
Okay, well, perhaps we can just learn something from slide 277 of the Hutchings slide deck, which is excerpted at tab 5 of the compendium. You see the period at the top says hydro : 1977 to 1998.
Mhm.
So would it surprise you that Mr. Hutchings testified that he estimated economic rents until 1998?
Oh, no, I know that he did that. That's how we got the $3.2 billion in the figure on my demonstrative. And I thought I testified to that yesterday.
I had understood you testified yesterday to 1992.
I testified that the analysis goes to to 1998. But that the statement is made that the benchmarks that were used were unreliable. You said that's a typo, but that's the
Yes.
contrast I'm drawing. And I wasn't mean to make a big deal out of this because it could be a typo. But we have the fact that we have testimony or a written report saying there was no reliable benchmark, yet analysis that assumes a benchmark. And that contrast, I made a point of that in my report. I expected that to be cleared up by people admitting that. It hasn't been done as far as I know. And I just raised it on that context.
Okay, so if you were advised that it was a typo, you would accept that. You understand people make mistakes sometimes.
It's possible. If the testimony is that that was a typo, then it would be a typo. And it would be, they would claim that this is a reliable benchmark. It really comes down to their determination and their claims about what is a reliable benchmark here.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, perhaps now is a good time for the lunch break.
Thank you. Go off record.